Among the forces driving Boston's tight housing market is the growing demand for short-term rentals. Community Labor United has come out with a new report on how this affects the rest of the housing market and how the city should respond through regulation. To explain are the author of the report, a researcher with Community Labor United, Sarah Jimenez, and the executive director of the Chinese Progressive Association, Chen. Thank you both for being with us.
Thank you.
I want to start with Sarah because you had to look and see what was out there. I mean, how many units are we talking about being used for this kind of housing?
Sure. So as of a couple of months ago, the latest data that we have available, there were at least 4,500 units, Airbnb listings in Boston. And because of the data that we have access to, that's actually a conservative estimate.
Now, I mean, in some cases, I imagine a short-term rental means somebody who has a spare room, and here's this recent college grad from Europe or Asia who wants to check out America, and they stay in there. They're very quiet, and it's no problem. And I guess you have some other kinds of clients, too.
That's right. Yeah, we want to be clear up front that when we talk about this report that we issued, is really focused on commercial short-term rentals, and that does not mean folks who have a spare room who are renting it out, or even if it's the whole apartment when they're out of town. But we're focused on commercial operators who have actually made a whole business model out of using whole housing units en masse and using them exclusively for short-term stays instead of for longer-term resident leasing.
Chen, why is this such a concern in Chinatown now?
So Chinatown is a pretty small neighborhood. We've been impacted by excessive luxury development and ownership turnover. And most recently, the trend is that when ownership turnover happens, some of the building actually turn into exclusively for Airbnb type of short-term rental.
Now, one of the incentives that must come into play here is that I guess you can get a lot more in rent for a short-term rental than you could from maybe other kinds of housing, right?
Oh, yeah. And basically, we have seen there's one building in 106 Tyler Street. It was renovated in 2008. The owner bought it at that point a little bit over $1.5 million, and then most recently in end of May, it was sold for over $3 million. And with the intention that the new owner had turned the whole building, 10 units, into Airbnb rental.
Sarah, I imagine this problem might be less noticeable if it's in a part of the city that's dominated by a more or less transient population. But I guess some of these units are in other neighborhoods where you've got mostly long-term residents, maybe even next door. What about the disruptions in some of these cases?
Sure. So part of what the report looked at was it took some stories from folks who are able to stay in neighborhoods, but where their neighborhoods are seeing maybe a larger number of rentals or more frequent use of the rentals by outsiders. So one of the stories in the report is actually a fellow from Chinatown who was telling us about how his landlord used one of the rentals for short-term rentals, and there were parties, and there were guests there who were very disrespectful. People would leave trash on the sidewalks. People would have parking violations. It can really affect quality of life.
And I think you had a problem in East Boston too, didn't you?
That's right. Yes. So actually, on the local level, a number of neighborhood groups are starting to speak out about how their own personal stories, local stories about how guests disrupt quality of life in neighborhoods. Yeah.
Karen, it would seem that if you can get more money from using housing in this way, then I guess there ought to be maybe a different tax rate, and maybe you can do something with that extra money to help the rest of the city. Any ideas along those lines?
Oh yeah, we actually had a tour of Chinatown last week, and really stopping by some of the properties where we actually long-term tenants were being pushed out, and and have turned into short-term rental. Within just a few streets, there's a huge number of it, and we are seeing more and more actually these row houses on the market, at really high prices. You're talking about multiple $1 million, and it's really impacted the community. And so we're just asking, it's really important for Boston to have a one host, one home policy. There should be some regulations around health and safety, and they really should limit the number of short-term rentals that are allowed. And and I think that there should be a registry of all the short-term rentals, and there should be some kind of registration fee that actually used towards enforcement.
This has been News, and we're talking with Sarah Jimenez of Community Labor United and Karen Chen of the Chinese Progressive Association. Sarah, explain how this would work, because if you try to restrict this to just people who use the home as their primary residence, how would that work out exactly?
So what's good about this situation, at least, is that a number of other cities have tried to create regulations before us in the last couple of years. And these are cities, that, like Boston, have had housing problems. And so they're taking the same strategy of trying to make it clear in regulations that you only want to allow short-term rentals if the person living in it is the one who's offering it. So there are a couple different ways of doing that, and I believe that there are recommendations in the Boston level about how you might try to delineate more specifically in regulatory language. But I think the trickier problem that will take more attention is how to enforce. And that's because these transactions, especially on Airbnb, are taking place online. And they're taking place, the rental is in someone's private residence, so it's really not visible so much from the outside. So the question of how to enforce, how to monitor and track activity to the level that we can actually make sure that we're stopping commercial short-term rentals is really going to be the challenge.
Sure, and another challenge, I guess, is if you've got some place that's being used by people who are disruptive, you live down the street, you want to do something about it, so you call 311, and then maybe the city has a hard time figuring out who's in charge there, who owns it. I mean, who do we deal with? I mean, how do you correct that?
Well, I think that it would require, the first person they would call would be the landlord. And I think it would really also require, all the websites that do short-term rental to turn over data to the city. And that, if there's a registry, that should say, who the landlords are and, who the contact is. And I think that, tenants, the problem in Chinatown is that, if it's not regulated, everyone is going to want to turn their apartment into short-term rental, and that would be detrimental to a neighborhood like Chinatown. And, Chinatown is one of the neighborhoods actually make Boston, a vibrant city. We don't want it, to just have, tourists. We don't want to just cater, to tourists. And that is not a sustainable way to actually, to build the city.
So explain it, because it's one thing for these scattered people who want to use their primary residence for this purpose, but if you've got corporations, talk about the scale of things, because they're buying units in bulk in some cases.
Sure, it's not necessarily that they're buying it in bulk, but they're accumulating them. So one of the things that our report focuses on is really trying to understand how much of a role commercial short-term rentals are playing in the larger industry. And what we found is, first of all, that the short-term rental industry as a whole has seen tremendous growth in the past few years. So just last year, 2016, Airbnb listings in Boston grew by 44%. And so then if you look at commercial short-term rentals specifically, they do represent a major segment of the industry. In Boston, about more than a quarter, 28% of listings are likely to be commercial short-term rentals, according to our analysis.
Now, I'm sure you're going to hear from somebody out there that a lot of the people who need this kind of housing, they're here for legitimate business. They could be here for academic reasons. They could be here for professional reasons. You've got these innovative, mobile people that we need for our economy. So how do you give them what they need without taking it away from the neighborhoods, I guess?
Sure. I think, there are clearly a lot of different reasons that people will offer rental space, and different reasons people come to use rental space. And I think this comes back again to this question of, having the clear regulations that specify what's allowed and what's not, and then also very strong enforcement measures to make sure that we can follow up on our rules. And again, that comes back to the quality of the data that we have access to. Reliable access to good data about who's using what kind of space for what is the most important resource we can have in trying to enforce our regulations to protect housing.
Karen, talk about your getting a handle on what was going on with those units in Chinatown. I mean, was that difficult to figure out exactly what was going on and who was in charge?
It's not that difficult. Actually, one of our residents did a project, on his own and did an audit of one day in May how many Airbnb rental there. And some of it's clear what the address is, and then some of it, by looking at the pictures, you kind of can figure out, where is it. So there are Airbnb units in the row houses, but they're also within the new luxury buildings. There's also Airbnb rental as well. And, and I think that also too, it's like, well, if a building, we're not saying that there should not be any Airbnb rental. We're saying that it should be regulated, and people who are actually buying buildings, trying to profit on it, is actually violating zoning law as well. Basically, they're illegally using their units for commercial uses, and I think that's illegal, and that's why we need to crack down on these corporate landlords.
Sarah, if this was really legalized, put on the radar screen, and then you have the assessing department saying, well, this property is being used in this way, it's actually, the value should be higher, they should pay higher taxes. I mean, what could that mean in revenue?
Revenue from the short-term rentals, you mean as
Yes,
taxes?
tax revenue for the city.
Sure, yeah. I think, so there's currently legislation at the state level that would help us be able to tax short-term rentals as legal businesses. And I think in different cities, they have seen different results in terms of actually collecting revenue. Because again, one of the challenges is if we don't have a way to track activity, then we can't go after operators when they're not actually paying what they're supposed to. But I believe that in other cities, they've seen several $1 million in tax revenue in the first few years of new regulations rolling out. So that could possibly happen for Boston as well.
We should mention you've got the whole report on the website for Community Labor United.
That's right, yeah. The website is www.massclu.org. That's MASSCLU.org. And it's the growth of commercial short-term rentals in Boston.
Thank you very much for being with us, Sarah Jimenez from Community Labor United and Karen Chen from Chinese Progressive Association.